At the time we've already formed a quorum. Let's get started. First, we have to elect a chairman. Nominations, please. Any nomination? Dr. Wai-kwok. Any seconder? I second. Chairman, I'm willing to be the chairman. Okay, Dr. Lu, you've accepted the nomination. So please take over as the chairman of the meeting. Thank you. Thank you for electing me as chairman. First thing that we need to do is to decide if we need to have a deputy chairman and our estimate of the workload and how long will it take for us to complete the scrutiny. And if it takes a long time, then it's better to have a deputy chairman so that we can have more flexibility. All right, you're shaking your head, so we don't need to have a deputy chairman then. Next, there's also a request to join the committee. We have Mr. Wai-kwok who would like to join. He's a latecomer, so he missed the deadline and he'd like to join now. So would members agree? Any objection? No objection. Okay, so we will have Mr. Wai-kwok as a member of the subcommittee. All right, let's invite the administration team to join us, and we'll invite them to brief us on the legislation. Okay, we have with us Mr. Rex Chang Wai-yun, Deputy Secretary for Development from the Development Bureau, Mr. Ryan Chiu, Principal Assistant Secretary, Mr. Hui Siu Wai, Deputy Director of Buildings, and from the DEVB we have Mr. Lai Kai Pang and Mr. Chow Kim Peng, Assistant Director from the Buildings Department, and Mr. Robinson Chung, Chief Professional Officer, Buildings Department, and Mr. Thomas Leung, Chief Building Surveyor from the Buildings Department, and Ms. Lisa Chu, Senior Building Surveyor from the Buildings Department, and Ms. Irene Cheung, Assistant Secretary from the Development Bureau. Can I invite the administration team to brief us on the details of the subsidiary legislation before we open the floor for discussion? Well, thank you, Chairman. I think the paper has already set out the proposed subsidiary legislation. Let me briefly supplement on 2 points. Well, let me highlight 2 salient points. First of all, the purpose of the subsidiary legislation. Well, the proposed amendment is to introduce a signboard control system. As we explained on the 7th of January this year at the development panels meeting, we hope that through the SBCS, we hope that before the commencement date, and we're proposing the 2nd of September, we hope that signboards that are up to standards can, after safety inspection and validation and reinforcement, can stay. And for owners of signboards within a 5-year period after the first registration, they will have to submit a fresh validation and certificate. In other words, they will have to do the inspection once every 5 years. For those that have failed, then the buildings department will take enforcement action. With regard to unauthorized building works, we have conducted an initial inspection. We have 120,000 right now, according to our records. When compared to the 190,000 that we set out in the paper, is somewhat fewer. But still, the number is rather colossal. It's 120,000. But then we have to consider it from different perspectives. And the purpose is to ensure safety of the unauthorized signboards. As we said, there are 120,000, and the number is quite large. Most of them are being used by the shop operators or shop owners. And if we just eliminate them all together in one go indiscriminately, then other than the fact that it's quite a colossal task, it will also bring a lot of inconvenience to the shop operators. And bearing in mind the fact that most of the unauthorized signboards are not posing imminent danger, we believe that without affecting business activities, we would also have to resolve the problem of safety of signboards, and therefore we can step up control of signboards. And at the same time, through this system, we hope that gradually we can establish this signboard database within the buildings department, so that the BD will be able to have better understanding of the situation. For example, who's the owner, what's the location, and also the dimension of such signboards. And such database would definitely help the BD in taking enforcement action against unauthorized signboards. Secondly, under the SBCS, the signboard control system, there are certain details that I'd like to highlight here. I'll be very brief. Alright, the system is built on the basis of the existing minor works program, and under this minor works program, as you might recall, before the 31st of December 2010, for such UBWs, for example, unauthorized support for air conditioners and so on, after validation and verification, if they are safe, then no removal order will be issued against them, and there will also be no warning against them. But then under the current SBCS as proposed, we do allow for some existing unauthorized signboards, after registered professionals or contractors have carried out an inspection, and if they are proven to be safe, then there is no need for them to be removed. But then if they have failed to register, then they would also be removed by the BD. And most of these signboards would be smaller, and they pose relatively less danger. And therefore, we propose that with regard to the dimension and also the type of the signboards, we will be making reference to the MWCS, the Minor Works Control Systems specifications, and for those in excess of those specifications, they would not be allowed to join the SBCS, and the BD will take enforcement action under the Buildings Ordinance, the BO. Finally, we'd like to stress that the SBCS is one of the measures in dealing with unauthorized building works. We've actually put in place a series of programs, and will be stepping up enforcement action against unauthorized signboards. And for those that do not take part in the scheme, they will be issued with removal orders, and the owners will be required to remove the signboards. And on top of that, before the commencement of the program, we will roll out an extensive publicity and education program. Will be briefing the trade, and the BO will also be offering technical advice and leaflets to the owners and contractors. We will set out all the details under the scheme to these stakeholders. So I welcome questions. Thank you. All right, thank you, Mr. Chang, for your presentation, and the floor is now open to members. All right, Mr. Kwok has also arrived. Yes, thank you, Chairman. Just now, the Director or the Deputy Secretary said that the unauthorized signboards will have to meet certain standards. Can we be told the standards? And you also refer to these signboards are having to be inspected once every 5 years. So you're apparently suggesting that they are unauthorized and yet they will be allowed to remain or stay. Well, many owners have said that, well, in the past for UBWs, well, they would only, action will only be taken against them if they pose danger, but then subsequently it was tightened up, and whether or not they pose danger, action will be taken against them. So would that apply to signboards too? Would that be a situation whereby you'll be remedying the situation, and why don't you just take action to eliminate or phase out such unauthorized signboards? Mr. Chang, thank you, Mr. Kwok, for your questions. Let me answer the second point first. It's about the specifications of the SBCS. I'll ask the Buildings Department colleague to supplement later. Well, first of all, the main reason why we are introducing this control system, that's because of the large number of signboards. We're actually talking about 120,000. And if the BD is to take care of that with its current resources, then it will take a long time for enforcement action to be taken against all of them. And as I said at the beginning, most of these signboards were according to the initial assessment by the BD. Well, we have done some initial inspections. We believe that most of them do not pose any imminent danger. And for those that have been after the introduction of the MWCS on the 31st of December 2010, we believe that with regard to drying racks, small canopies, and so on, well, they can be prosecuted. Well, even though they are still unauthorized building works, Mr. Kwok was right. But then for drying racks, they are relatively small signboards, and they are relatively small works, and therefore they can be tolerated. And of course, signboards would be somewhat different from minor works, but then given the huge number of signboards, and many of them do not pose immediate danger, and some of them have actually got to be tolerated, and they are under a relatively special category of unauthorized building works. And as I said, for drying works, small canopies, and so on, they are under this NWCS. That's why we believe that they have to be under control. And of course, there is no doubt about the fact that they are unauthorized, but then we have to have power under the law, so that after taking prosecution against these signboards, we can decide not to take enforcement action against them. But then by not posing any immediate danger, are you going to conduct visual inspection only? And there is no professional to certify that the unauthorized signboards do not pose immediate danger? Is that the case? Well, with regard to this point and the other point that you mentioned earlier, I'll defer to the Buildings Department. Yes, Mr. Hui. Yes, Mr. Hui Siwai.
Thank you, Chairman. Now, there are different ways to tackle unauthorized signboards. One is on a complaint basis. When we receive complaints in relation to the safety of signboards, we will dispatch staff to inspect the signboards. Of course, it is done by visual inspection, but we will deploy professional staff to inspect the signboards so we can gauge the safety of signboards in a professional manner. Apart from that, we also have large-scale action, which is done on a district basis. Every year, we pick busier districts with heavy traffic and more signboards for the scheme, and more unauthorized signboards can be effectively dealt with. Now, the third approach is with the help of district councils and local groups. We deal with abandoned signboards. They notify us of where these unwanted and abandoned and unmanaged signboards are, so that they can be dealt with. So through these approaches, basically, the signboards have been dealt with by and large, and we feel that for existing signboards in Hong Kong, we hope to have a more effective way of dealing with them. By the validation scheme, we can conduct inspections. This is also a more pragmatic approach as far as resources are concerned. As for the specifications of unauthorized signboards under this control system or the scope of the validation scheme, I will defer to Assistant Director Mr. Chow to take this question. Mr. Alex Chow. Now there are 3 classes of minor works under the system, depending on the complexity of the works and the level of danger. For projecting signboards, the area could be up to 20 square meters. The second class, 10 square meters. Third class, not larger than 1 square meter. And that's categorized or classified depending on the risk level. For wall signboards, Class 1, an area of up to 40 square meters. Class 2, 10 square meters. Class 3, 5 square meters. Apart from complying with the display area specifications, those signboards under the validation scheme must also comply with certain requirements as far as their locations are concerned. For example, they must not project or be extended up to 4 square meters beneath above a pavement, and there must not be any obstruction to ventilating windows or corridors, and all these specifications will be set out in the technical guidelines. Next, Mr. Wu Chi-wai, followed by Mr. Tony Chair. Thank you, Chairman. Even if the piece of legislation is good, there may still be difficulties when it comes to enforcement. First of all, these minor works contractors should be responsible for taking part in the validation scheme, but will they really be responsible? I'd like to share my view about the mandatory windows inspection scheme with you, because it's not mentioned in the paper. Under the MWIS, the owner is required to engage a contractor to inspect windows. However, out of a business incentive, definitely the contractor concerned will be able to pick out shortcomings and for repair works to be done, so that in the end owners will need to pay more money. So in terms of safety requirements, well, are they in fact unnecessary requirements? Are you only forcing owners to sign contracts with contractors? Again, about the scheme, it's about control of signboards, but having heard your remarks, now first of all, I don't know why you are not locating owners of signboards who are unwilling to take part in validation schemes. You say that, of course, there will be routine inspections, but if these owners don't approach you, then you have to rely on your own inspections. So how effective will this scheme be? And do you have a target under which all the signboards in Hong Kong will be included in your database? You say that sooner or later this will be done, but how long will this take? Secondly, there are stringent requirements imposed on contractors. For example, the one finishing works faster may be able to get your approval documents, but for the contractor finishing works second, because of, say, spatial requirements not met, they might not get your approval. So, of course, you might want people to get their signboards validated as soon as possible, so that for latecomers they might lose out. So I'd like to know your comment on this. Thirdly, all along you have said that there are 190,000 signboards, but now you say that there are only 120,000 remaining. I'd like to know the reason for the substantial decrease. And also, after the large-scale inspection, you should have registered or recorded the owners of these 120,000 unauthorized signboards, so that you can follow up on them later. 4 questions. Yes, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Wu Chi-wai, for your question. Maybe I will take the questions on signboard control, and I'll defer to my BD colleagues to answer you on the disputes with contractors and also on the large-scale inspections. Maybe I say something more about large-scale inspections. The figure has come down to 120,000 because, as we said in 2010, there was an overall review by the HA on the signboards on the external walls of the buildings. Perhaps my BD colleagues can further supplement my answer. On signboard control, there are 2 types involved. Even if, for one type, even if they are eligible under the validation scheme, they might not come forward to ask for validation. And under such circumstances, the Buildings Department will, through carrying out inspections, identify these signboards and issue removal orders. For the second type, these are signboard owners who has come forward to ask for validation, and we will then look at the particulars of the owners and the locations of signboards. One advantage of the scheme is that after they come forward and provide the BD with their information, after 5 years, they are supposed to come back after 5 years for another safety audit. And if this is not being done, the Buildings Department will know that another validation hasn't been done, and then the BD can take action by, for example, conducting inspection or checking to see if the signboard owners have forgotten about the validation 5 years down the road. And these are follow-up work, and there shouldn't be any problem. Can you say something more? If these signboards are not reported, then will you have any idea of the situation of these unreported signboards? Well, as I said just now, the Buildings Department will continue to conduct large-scale operations against signboards. Validation scheme is just one of the elements of the control system in tackling existing signboards. We still have other areas of work, for example, enforcement action by BD. Now, before you defer to your BD colleagues, can you tell me whether the validation scheme will be able to resolve the ownership issue? The external wall of buildings may involve different stakeholders. And once you approve signboards to be erected, what will happen to the dispute? For example, you have approved the erection of signboards at a certain place, and yet the place has actually belongs to another owner. So will this cause embarrassment to the government? That is to say, you're approving signboards to be hung at a place that you have no legal right to do so. Yes, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Wu. It's a very good question, and this question has been asked before. Basically, in the Buildings Ordinance, we look at the safety of structure and building plans, and actually signboards are not under the purview of the BO. And we understand that where signboards are hung at the parts of the building where the owner doesn't have any rights or land rights, then we will inform the owner's corporation of the building. We hope that by doing so, the owners will understand that signboards will be erected or hung on the external wall of buildings. And before rolling out the validation scheme, the BD will step up publicity to emphasize this piece of information. And who would like to take the question? Mr. Lee, Mr. Hui. I will supplement the details of the scheme. Over the past 2 years, we engaged a consultant to conduct a stock taking of signboards outside the external walls of private buildings. The consultant would take photos on the 4 sides of the buildings concerned and would do stock taking, and after the consultant completed this work, we then analyzed the information or data collected, and this is how the 120,000 come by. Of course, more analysis is required, for example, in relation to size of signboards and locations of signboards and whether there are irregularities involved. Now, one of the tasks of the consultant during inspection was to check if the signboards were structurally sound. If there were problems, they would inform us. So we're basically processing this data, and no data relating to the ownership of signboards have been collected. This is not the responsibility of the contractor. We have our database is very large. Apart from the 120,000 unauthorized signboards, there are different kinds of other signboards involved. Now, on tackling signboards, what are our strategies? Simply put, there are 2 different procedures for handling new signboards and existing signboards. Now, for new signboards, the owners would apply through the official channel to erect signboards. Of course, the records will be kept very neatly, and this will be done in the most stringent manner.
And then under the MWCS, there were thousands of signboards that have been identified. So these are new signboards, and therefore in terms of the safety specifications, they are able to meet our standards. So for new signboards, we do have signboards that are able to meet the specifications. And then for some existing signboards, we will take a gradual approach under the current inspection scheme, and we are currently looking at those in excess of 20 square meters. The number is not that large, but then we do believe that we have made some good progress. We believe that the number of such signboards will reduce. And secondly is the proposed SBCS and also the validation program. Through the validation scheme, owners of existing signboards will at least be able to ensure that at least they are safe, even though they are still unauthorized. But then what about the remaining large number of signboards? Well, we do have many signboards that are unauthorized building works, but then they have nothing to do with other unauthorized building works, and some of these signboards are actually overhanging at the shop front, and they have nothing to do with safety. So the size would be relatively small, and in terms of danger, they do not pose much danger, and therefore through these different approaches, we hope to validate them, and we will inspect them, and we will take enforcement action. We hope to control or put the situation under control. As regards the first come first served basis under the validation scheme, I'll defer to my colleague, Mr. Chow. Yes, Mr. Chow. Yes, just now colleagues asked about the inter-signboard space. Well, we will look at the horizontal distance instead of the vertical distance. In other words, well, you can be placed above another signboard, but then there is a requirement on the distance between two signboards. That's because of fire safety consideration, because we believe that many of these signboards should be able to meet our requirement with regard to some to the inter-signboard distance, and that's 2.4 meters. And for most of the projecting signboards, we are talking about an average about 4 meters outside the shop front, and therefore we believe that they should be able to meet this requirement. But then assuming that there are some signboards where the inter-signboard distance is less than 2.4, then the owner, upon validation comes forward, then we will give them priority in the processing. So even if they meet the specifications, but then if the inter-signboard distance is not able to meet your requirement, then they will also not be validated. And also some of the overhanging signboards will also be ruled out, right? Yes, the inter-signboard space should be 2.4 meters, but then if they are placed above another one, that's not a problem. But then for the wall signboards, of course, they must not obstruct the windows. Well, for the ordinary public, of course, they are not most concerned about the signboard above their shop in the shop front. Well, we do understand that situation, but then I think the concern is that for the protruding signboard, that will also be included in 120,000, right? Can you provide us with further information? Because I think to the public, they are most concerned about the projecting signboards, they are overhanging. So what's the number of those? And also, you just said that you would be conducting the inspection and you'll be looking at the larger ones first and then the smaller ones later. But then do you have any indicator as to how much time you plan to take to complete the program, so that you would at least have an idea as to how many signboards there are and what their specifications are? Because well, last time you engaged a consultant, and apparently you didn't even have a record of who those signboards belong to, and I had thought that you should have that information available, and therefore you should be able to go after the owner of the signboard if there is any problem. But then apparently you're starting from square one. You're asking people to report the ownership to you again, and there is no way that you can find out which signboard belongs to whom. and which signboard is up to standard, and which one has not been validated. Well, that's the same as what Mr. Kwok just said as to when the database can be established. Yes, according to what they said, well, you will have to rely on the validation system before you can have a full record of all the signboards, because this is indeed very tedious a job to do. Yes? Yes, when we take enforcement action, our colleagues would also go out to double check, both to find out the specifications of the signboards and who they belong to. And if it's a shop sign, then most likely it would belong to the shop. And if it's a rented space, then we will look at the information displayed on the signboard to track down to the owner. And of course, we will also collect such details on the spot. Yes, I'll give the floor to other members first. Mr. Tony Chair. Thank you, Chairman. Well, in the long run, phasing out unauthorized signboards would obviously be the administration's objective. But then you're actually talking about 120,000 new signboards. I share the view of Mr. Wu Chi-wai in the sense that, number one, yes, you're trying to engage authorized persons and also contractors to validate these signboards, certifying that they are safe. We hope that you can do this as soon as possible. While you embark on this scheme, we also hope that a deadline can be imposed, because as far as the profession is concerned, we hope that they can also help the owners to validate if their signboards are safe, because we've been talking about safety all the time. And yet on the part of the administration, you should also consider this after a while. And of course, we will have to set a time frame. And if the response is lackluster, then of course the administration will have to take over and do the job. You will have to either phase them out, or you will have to check if they are safe. I'm concerned about your manpower situation, and of course this is wishful thinking. We think that people will be very obliging, and therefore you can have all the details and information as soon as possible. But then both myself and Wu Chi-wai are very disappointed. Yes, safety is of course very important, but then let's say if we expect people to come forward to report the details, but then if we just look at the safety aspect without getting further information, all right, upon the obtaining of the information, it's up to you to decide if you'd like to take further action. But then for the owner, all right, there might be different property owners owning the signboards, and also in some cases even the owner is kept in the dark. They might not have given the approval or consent to the signboard owner to put up the signboard, and therefore more owners should be placed on the signboard owner. Yes, I understand that there are too many, but then at least you will have to consider this when it comes to enforcement against new and old signboards. Apparently, the department is most concerned about safety. But then as far as the public are concerned, it's not just about one single department, it's about the entire administration's work. So it's not just about one department. Well, we understand that when it comes to applications, if you try to submit a plan, then of course is for the applicant to submit a plan, and if you go to the TPB making an application, then you will have to have the consent of the owner. But then for signboards, apparently, without the consent of the owner, should you be giving approval to them? And of course, I understand that you do have a tight manpower, and you may not be able to distinguish between those that have been put up with the consent of the owner and those who without. But then for the public, they are of course very concerned about safety. In particular, some of the signboards are very large. And you said that there would be guidelines, for example, 4.2 meters. And sometimes we can see that some of these signboards are really very large. and they can be 4.2 meters from the external wall of the signboard, but then they are really very tall. And can you require them to provide further information? Have they taken out insurance policy? Is there any insurance coverage, for example? So in the end, you will have to tighten up the control. And you do hope that for raw signboards in excess of a certain specification or dimension, they will have to seek approval from your minor works control system. If you do not do that, then there will be many problems. And the second point that I'd like to make is, yes, we know that it's not just about the dimension of the signboards, the thickness, and so on. We are also concerned about light pollution. We also hope that the government can do something about it. We are all talking about light or excessive illumination, and Ms. Sitho knows it too well. So you will also have to take this into consideration for new signboards. Should they be emitting too much light? Well, because they are really very colorful and they are very bright. And what about the hours during which they might be switched on? And also, some of them are multicolor, and that might also affect drivers. So even if you might not be able to do everything in one go, you will have to consider tightening it up gradually. And also for the 5-year inspection, I'd like to know the government's assessment. Do you think that the 5-year cycle is good enough? Is that done on the basis of your manpower level? All right. As these are not new signboards, some of them have already been there for a while. So is 5-year a reasonable period? And also on phasing them out for the abandoned ones and for those that have not been taken care of, nobody admits to be its owner. Then what are you going to do about them? Yes, as you have noticed, I have not imposed any time restriction because this is the first meeting with regard to the stakeholders to the scheme. We would like to know as much as possible because this has to do with people's livelihood. We are talking about 120,000 signboards throughout the territory. That's why I have not imposed a time control. Yes, Mr. Rex Chan. Yes, thank you, Mr. Tony Chair, for your questions. I'll attempt to answer them, and for the rest, I'll defer the Buildings Department to supplement. With regard to the time frame, how much time will it take for us to deal with all of them? Yes, 120,000, and also as we have not started the validation scheme yet, we will have to look at the response after it's been introduced. As Mr. Chair has suggested, of course, as soon as we start the program, we hope that everyone will immediately come forward and report to us. And therefore, we hope that if we manage to get the support of members for the subsidiary legislation to come into effect in September, we hope that in around 2 years' time, we can conduct a review. In other words, what's the response of the application?
And the response and the difficulties encountered when we process the validation and whether we have sufficient resources. We are going to conduct a review in about 2 years' time. Of course, right now it's difficult for us to say when we will clear the validation of all 120,000, but with the limited resources of the Buildings Department, we will try our best. Now, another point raised by Mr. Tony Chair is the reporting of signboards and ownership issue and light pollution. And Mr. Chair also pointed out very clearly that under the BO, the objective and also our concern is the safety risk involved. This is the first thing we need to tackle. And there are other issues as well, just like ownership, and this has to do with the title of the building. And there are also guidelines for the sector to follow. Well, Mr. Chair also talked about insurance. So it can really cover a wide scope. And at this stage, we want to, first of all, deal with the safety issue. I think this is the of utmost concern of everyone. And this is also what we can do within our power. But it doesn't mean we're not concerned about other issues. For example, ownership and other issues, we're also concerned about them. And in our publicity program and at the application stage, we'll also inform overseas of this scheme. Now, about light pollution. Last year, in January, the Environment Bureau issued a best practices on preventing light pollution, and this note will also be issued to the industry to remind them of the relevant matters. So all in all, we want to deal with the safety issue first. Mr. Chair also asked whether 5-year period is appropriate. We set the period at 5 years after making reference to the enforcement actions by the Buildings Department in the past, and we try to strike a balance. If the period is too short, it will become too frequent, and there will be a burden on owners. I won't say it's a nuisance, but if owners are required to report every year or once every 2 years, it will be very burdensome for them. So, judging from past experience, we think 5-year period is appropriate. Mr. Chair. Well, there are difficulties, of course, but I don't want to disseminate a wrong message to the public because they are actually against or breaching the law. I think that in the form you can provide more information. I say that this is a more relaxed approach already, because if you have information, it will serve as a reminder that the owner should be, or the title owner should be notified, and you should have this information. Well, of course, as far as legislation is concerned, it's more complex, and you want to deal with safety issues first. But I don't want the public to have an impression that they can go ahead with erecting signboards first and have them validated later. So I would just want to supplement this point. I hope the administration would consider this as a reminder, or because you need to get the consent of title owners before you take action. If it's done on the government land, of course, it can be phased out immediately. Now, if you shift the responsibility onto owners, of course, owners do have responsibilities, but this is also a point of consideration. As said just now, when you file an application with the Town Planning Board, then, well, there are requirements. If you are not the owner, you should get the owner's consent. it's just a simple application. There's just a piece of land and without any structure, and now there is a structure involved, and the government should think about it. That is, you're asking when they make the application whether this information should be provided, or you're only going to deal with safety issue and nothing else, and all other issues like ownership and insurance, they will be put aside. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your suggestion. We'll see how this can be incorporated. Insurance, well, we haven't thought about that. We can go back and consider whether insurance can also be included in the application form so that we can require them to provide this information. In fact, well, the requirement to provide information is just educational. You can put down something like you're required to take out insurance. So does that mean there is no legal responsibility just by filling out the form? Well, Chairman, I understand that if we make substantial changes today, the enforcement action might be a long way to go. So this is just my suggestion. I'm open to my colleagues' views. I just feel that we should not give the public this message that this department is doing so and so, because in the eyes of the public, they do not discern between departments. They just think that it's a government as a whole. Chairman, I think we'll go back and consider which bits in the form should be reported and which bits can be put down as reminders. For example, you should pay attention to matters like light pollution, title or land rights, etc. Mr. Chen Hanpan. Thank you, Chairman. First of all, I'd like to praise the department for their work in handling unwanted signboards. We have been criticizing the existence of unwanted signboards after the closure of businesses, and I think this is properly handled. And on the signboard control system, now the land title issue, it's a big issue, and I think the department should follow up on it. In the past, when signboards were hung and when the public felt that it's against the law, they could ring the building authority and photos would be taken, and signboards such as these would not be allowed to exist. And now you allow applications for validation, and some time is needed. Well, what happens if in the process you receive complaints from the public whilst the signboard is being erected? Should it go ahead or not? I'm concerned about the possible disputes. What if for new signboards, if there are complaints, well, the department can consider not to approve them, and there are 120,000 existing signboards at the moment, and if there is objection from members of the public or the OCs, etc., how will the department handle this situation? Second question. The minor works contractor registration system has been implemented a short time ago, and now works have to be conducted by registered contractors. So how many eligible registered contractors are there? The scheme was implemented just a short time ago, and signboards may be big projects. They might need to apply for permits, and this is also a concern shared by many contractors. What if the business closes down, then who should be responsible for demolishing the leftover signboards? Another question is on plan approval. Even if approval has been given, once the signboard is erected, they need to go through the validation process before the contractor can get money from the owner, and this will cause a cash flow problem. So do you have some sort of performance pledge so that people can make arrangements? How long will the process take? Yes, thank you, Mr. Chan, for your two questions. About the contractors, I'll defer to my BD colleagues. The first point is on ownership or land ownership. This is a rather complex issue. Under the Buildings Ordinance, we do not impose any regulation on property management. This is done by another piece of regulation. This subsidiary legislation is about the requirement for a validation process. Now, even if this subsidiary legislation is passed, the problem will still exist. This is not under the scope of the Buildings Ordinance. As said by Mr. Chair just now, in the validation process, we will see whether they're required to report certain matters and whether the OCs should be informed. And I'll defer to my colleague in the Buildings Department to take the second question. Well, I will say something about the number of registered contractors. As at the end of last year, those contractors that can take up the work of erecting or inspecting signboards, well, there are 1,740 of them, responsible respectively for classes 1, 2, and 3. Do they also do mandatory window inspection scheme as well? No, these are separate. Of course, some contractors can be eligible for various schemes, and there were over 7,000 of them. I'll defer to my colleague on the validation point. Now, validation scheme, as long as the signboard owner engages competent professional personnel or registered contractors to carry out inspection, and carry out any strengthening works if necessary, they can then fill out a form with the information provided and submit the form to the Building Department. We will then conduct random inspections, and we will issue a letter, a confirmation letter on receipt of the application for validation as soon as possible. So once the shop is moved, who should be responsible for the leftover signboard? Under the scheme, we would have information about the signboard owners, and even if he's moved, we will pursue the matter with the owner. With whom? With the contractor or signboard owner? The signboard owner. Just a follow-up question. Just now, DS talked about one point on ownership. You are not responsible for following up on the land title issue, but once you give your approval, and if someone objects, how will you handle the situation? Will you withdraw your approval or what?
Alright, if there's already objection at the time of application, then how would that be dealt with? Well, just whether it's a small signboards or if it's under, and whether it's under the validation scheme. Basically, it's not like submitting a plan for the erection of a new signboard. Well, we are just receiving that as a record, and then that would be input in our database, and then the AP, the professional or the contractor, will have to prove that they've already checked the signboard in accordance with the specifications. So it's not an application system, it's not an approval system. But then in the process, if somebody comes forward to say no to this or to raise objection, then of course we will do an inspection. We will look at the process of putting up the signboard. Is there anything that we can help? We have done that before. Yes, Chairman. This will involve several parties. Before Mr. Kwok left, he also raised this. Actually, this would involve the workers, the owner, and also the contractor. So, Chairman, will you arrange for them to come over and give us their views? Yes, we will deal with the issue later. Do we need to have a session with the deputations? Next, Sit Ho, and then Wu Chi Wai asking for the second time. Ms. Sit Ho first. Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to ask the officials, all right, in 2004, this piece of legislation was enacted, and now it's almost 9 years, and still we have 120,000. How many of them are newly erected? So for the old signboards, yes, the number was very large. I couldn't remember exactly how many there were in 2004, and yet some 9 years down the road, we still have 120,000, and therefore the number is really very large. And therefore, I suspect that even upon the enactment of legislation, because of your tight manpower situation, there might have been some new signboards being put up, because we have also received complaints, because some residents said that actually some signboards have been put up without making an application, and even after the BD came in, nothing was done about it. So there are still unauthorized signboards coming out day in, day out. So what's the purpose of this subsidiary legislation? Which will come first? Is safety the first priority? Or is it that with the legislation in place, and if they do not make an application and if they still erect the signboards because you'd like to provide a business-friendly environment, that's why you'd like to have this in the interim, so that for those who have not made an application, you'd just like to set up a database so that you would know at least that they comply with the specifications. All right, there are two types of illegal works. One is they are not able to meet the specifications. In fact, they are not safe at all. They cannot meet the safety specifications. The other one would be they meet the specifications, but then they have not made an application. Sometimes people might just put up the signboards anyway, and they cannot be bothered with the legal procedures and approval from the authorities, and they might have engaged an AP in doing the job. So what's the purpose, what's the objective of introducing the scheme? I understand that there will be some difference. All right, if it's for public safety, then you will take the initiative to take a proactive action. So you'll be checking your database, you'll be finding out who has not made an application, and if it's not safe, then you will single them out for action. But then I understand that we have also put this to the buildings department, and this buildings department is in serious shortage of staff. So what will be given top priority? Because I'm worried that with this piece of legislation in place, if your primary objective is to allow shop operators to put up signboards because you don't want to see any unauthorized works there because it's an eyesore, and therefore you're just trying to set up the database, and then you're giving them subsequent approval, and you don't want to delay the program so that you would only be able to inspect them after 5 years. So other than the law itself, there are also some administrative problems that have to be resolved, and with shortage of manpower, whether it's a temporary measure or what, you will have to resolve it anyway, or else you're just trying to be more light-handed so that everybody will be able to go around or go about their business lawfully. You will not be able to resolve the problem. For example, you said that for the horizontal space, well, even if they are in for the shop front signs, is not a big problem. But then in Tsim Sha Tsui, there's a Thai restaurant, but then it's a wooden signboard, but then after a week or two's downpour, the signboard just fell, and as a result, it killed a passerby. So, Chairman, my most critical issue or question is, what's the primary objective? What types of signboards are you targeting? Are you looking at safety first? If that's the case, then you will have to have enough manpower. That's the basic problem. But then if you're just trying to provide a business-friendly environment, but then public safety is still at risk, I think this is really window dressing, because it's not going to solve the core of the problem. And I can see that for the wording, you've also copied from the principal legislation. Alright, they are required to submit a picture showing the current state of affairs. Well, that was done because for some existing supporting frames for air conditioners and also drying racks, it's not possible for them to come up with a building plan. That's why you're lowering the requirement and you're just asking for a picture. And also for some existing works, you try to be more relaxed. That's why you only required a picture. But then if it's about public safety, for those who have never submitted any building plans at all, and now you're setting up a database, and all you are asking for is only a picture. And even for signboards that are protruding, that have a dimension of over 40 square meters, if they just submit pictures, they will not be able to convince you or tell you if they are safe. Given the fact that they have to engage a professional to do the validation, then why are you not requiring them to submit a formal plan or a proper plan? Several questions. So, Deputy Secretary. Yes, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Ho, for your questions. On the last point about the submission of pictures, so I'll ask the department to explain how it operates. I'd like to first talk about the objective, because Ms. Ho asked time and again about the objective of the scheme. So that's a more fundamental issue. What's the objective? Well, under the MWCS, shortly before the commencement of the scheme, by the end of 2010, alright, even for small or minor works, they will have to get the consent of the owner and the approval from the buildings department before they can start works. And then after the coming into effect of the MWCS, as I said, well, some similar signboards could also be subject to the MWCS. In other words, some of them do not have to submit any building plans. They can just complete the works, and then they can just submit a report to the BD for record, and that will be okay. But then the proposed validation scheme will be introduced. That's because we have already got 120,000 existing signboards. Earlier on, the assessment was 190,000. And if we just rely on the BD to take enforcement action, then the time and the resources that will be needed would be tremendous. And it's also not the most cost-effective way of going about it. And also for some of these signboards, as you said, well, they are being used by many shop operators. And according to the understanding of the BD, many of them do not pose any immediate danger, and that's why what we are most concerned about these signboards, in particular from the law enforcement perspective of the BD, the most important thing is safety. That's why we have now come up with a system, and we hope that for these shop operators or signboard owners, they can come forward to report that to us. In other words, they do have this signboard, and when they come to report to us, we are not just relying on their report. We also require a validation. That's very important. It's a safety inspection. It's a safety validation after they are proven safe. So that will have to be done by a professional. So we will know that this signboard has been reported and it's been checked and it's safe, and then 5 years later they will have to do another check. And also under this system, we will also be drawing a line, as I said, with members' approval. Then we hope that on the 2nd of September this year, it will come into effect. What does that mean? In other words, before the 2nd of September, well, we will treat all the signboards that have been put up before the 2nd of September as pre-existing signboards, and they can apply for registration under the new system. And then after the 2nd of September, well, if they are in line with the specifications, it's okay. If they have already filed an application, then it's okay. But then for new signboards that are put up after the 2nd of September, they will not be accepted. And the purpose is to ensure that for new signboards that will be put up in the future, they will follow the specifications under the MWCS. They will have to submit an application before they do that, and before then we will be able to deal with the 120,000 that are in existence already. And as I have repeatedly stressed, the BD will continue with this enforcement action even with the introduction of this scheme. So it doesn't mean that with the validation system in place that the BD will not be doing its job. The BD will continue with its enforcement action. All we're trying to do is to introduce a two-pronged approach. That is, mainly we rely on enforcement action to deal with the unauthorized signboards problem. And what we're trying to do is we are proposing this system. We hope that that can provide an alternative system so that signboard owners will be able to apply for registration. And if they're willing to take part, then we will have more signboards that can be treated as safe. So I think this is a complementary approach. With regard to the actual operation, I'll defer to the BD whether or not pictures are enough. Chairman, I'll be very brief. I really hope that the department and the Bureau can consider moving an amendment under the bill or the subsidiary legislation. It's almost like an amnesty, okay, for those that have failed to apply. You're actually asking them to come forward to report that to you, so that for law enforcement you are still short of staff. So you may have to hire some black market labor in order to deal with that. I'm not trying to argue that with you, but then there are two aspects, and I invite you to move amendments to those two. Number one, for those who have applied properly, they will have to submit plans. They are not allowed to submit pictures, and you're actually offering this amnesty to those who have not submitted an application. If they are only required to submit pictures, you will still not be able to tell if they are safe. So can you provide us with some technical details? For those that are large, over 40 square meters, it's almost like a small house. And if they are overhanging and still you allow them to just give you a picture, well, for those less than 1 square meters, maybe it's okay. But then for the large overhanging signboard, so can the BD give you some technical details? Well, there might be 1 or 2 categories which have not gone through the proper application procedures. In particular, the overhanging ones, well, even if they are wall mounted, still large ones are still very large, because for the MWCS, they will have to engage professionals, architects, engineers and so on to do it. So how come you are so relaxed about this one? You will have to tighten it up. And also for the 5-year program, I think it's just to tie in with the BD's manpower situation. All right, for new buildings, it's okay. But then for the older ones that are running into this repair, then you will have to be more stringent.
So on these 2 points, I hope the department can provide technical support and urge the Bureau to make amendments. If you don't do that, then I will be very subjective. I will ask for 3 years instead of 5 years. I know there is no technical basis for my argument. I just know that it's because of your tight manpower. The other point is the provision of photos requirement. You should tighten the requirement. If you don't put forward an amendment, I will Other things like light pollution, ventilation, I cannot change the primary legislation. We have expressed our views, but at least you should include these 2 points in your new subsidiary legislation to improve things. Thank you, Ms. Ho. She's made 2 suggestions. One on amendments. You're suggesting that for larger signboards, yes, those up to 40 square meters. You know the requirement, right? DS, you'd like to respond? Deputy Director. In fact, for the regulation tabled, we're providing information which are basic information after conducting inspections. So that the information includes photos to show the general situation. And if inspection is actually required, we will impose requirements under the minor works control system. If we come to the clause by clause stage, we can see that the professional person will be required to provide information in accordance with the minor works system, and they're required to provide building plans and do calculations. Chairman, is it mandatory? Yes, it is a mandatory requirement. They are subject to different requirements depending on the size of the signboards, and these are mentioned in the technical guidelines and etc. What we're saying is that at the initial stage of application, they are required to provide basic information like photos and the person responsible for erecting the signboards. Chairman, please ask the department to inform us of all these requirements in writing to be submitted next time. And please give us a reference of the provision involved. Well, because you talk about 39A, CA 1 and 2, and I asked the department to give us a written reply. If there are requirements, please tell us at what stage these requirements will be imposed. Because if only photos are required at the initial stage, I won't accept it. But the requirement of photos is only about the validation scheme. I think Ms. Ho's request is sound as well. Under various circumstances, at various stages, what will be the requirements in terms of provision of information? The administration should give us a reply in writing. If necessary changes will need to be made, because this basic information is about validation scheme. Well, we will then see if we're happy with the answer. If not, we'll make amendments, of course. Perhaps I will supplement. In this amendment exercise 62A states the actual situation, the description of the actual situation of the signboard concerned, and we are considering whether more data should be included, since professional engineer, etc. will be involved. And we're considering, we have considered whether such information should also be provided. Having considered this, we think that this general description or specific description should be included in the technical guidelines, including the calculations and specifications. So you're talking about the explanatory note. So why don't you include it as a legal responsibility. Well, I also took part in the primary legislation scrutiny in 2004. At that time, even for air conditioner supporting rack, they require plans to be submitted. Even for drying racks, they required small contractors to submit building plans. And that was why, subsequently, the requirement have been changed to the submission of photos. But now for large signboards, they require only photos. I don't think this will work. So the question is how the balance should be struck and what should be included in the provisions and what should be included in the explanatory note. I think more explanation is required. Chairman, I have made my suggestion. I think that the large signboards requirement should be included in the provisions, not in the technical guidelines. Would you like to answer this question now, or go back and think about it, Mr. Hui? I think the specific description of signboards, this is a legal requirement. But if we include all the details in relation to requirements for different signboards, the provisions will become very cumbersome. So we're only putting down the details in in the technical guidelines in relation to 39C. Chairman, I'll go back and dig up the stringent requirements in the primary legislation 2004 and propose amendments based on those requirements. Please explain your logic. Why is this approach so relaxed? I think it is also a standard practice to impose requirements in the technical guidelines, but I think Ms. Ho's point is where the line should be drawn. So perhaps you can go back and think about it. Yes, and also for the 5-year period. DS, your response? Ms. Ho, thank you, Chairman. Ms. Ho said that we are having an amnesty, but no, we're not doing that. The signboard control system is a more pragmatic way, in our view, of tackling the 120,000 unauthorized signboards. We hope that through this system, more signboards can be checked safe. And as mentioned, I think the most important point is how the balance should be struck. In the BD's past experience, in relation to the lifespan of signboards and also the, I'll try to avoid the word nuisance to shop owners. And may I say, frequent inspections to shop owners will incur costs on them. So we need to strike a balance, and we have therefore proposed a 5-year validity period. If the period is longer, we think it's not appropriate. If it's shorter, we think it may not be the best arrangement. So we think 5 years is the most appropriate. Now, I want to clarify, you have several areas of work. Validation is just one step. You also have inspection and enforcement. So if the participants have reported their unauthorized signboards and have it validated, even if they have done so, then if you find any problems during inspection, you will still take action. It's not the case that they can be fined as long as they go through the validation scheme. Well, if nothing is done on the part of owners, then these cases will only have to be discovered during your inspection. Mr. Hui, for the 5-year validation cycle, comparing to the present situation where we do not have any validation or inspection on a periodic basis, this is much better. And I also like to compare this with the mandatory building inspection scheme. Under that scheme, MBIS, they are required to conduct inspections on the signboards on the external walls of the building. If it's an existing signboard, then the owner is required to inspect and check if the signboard is safe, and if it's a UBW, an unauthorized signboards, then a report will have to be made to the buildings department. So these two schemes complement each other. On the one hand, under MBIS, for buildings aged 30 years or above, an inspection will have to be carried out once every 10 years. And for this scheme concerning signboards, the inspection cycle is one of 5 years. So they complement each other. The signboards will be subject to inspections on a regular basis. And we see that we do not just rely on a single piece of legislation or one action program to tackle signboards. We take a holistic approach. Chairman, database like this is better than nothing, but if you're amending the law, then you should do it properly. A 5-year cycle for new buildings is okay, but for older buildings, well, a lot of things could happen in between. Deputy Director just now talked about other inspection schemes throughout the period. So within the 5-year period, other works might be carried out. So please tell us in writing when these other inspections will be carried out. Chairman, finally, the commencement date of this regulation is the 2nd of September. Are you concerned whether more people will erect signboards before the 2nd of September in order to circumvent the complex procedure? I don't think there is a high likelihood of people rushing their works before the 2nd of September. Well, first of all, it's just a short time from the 2nd of September now, and they need time to erect signboards. They need to engage professionals to inspect and erect signboards. I don't think there is a great difference. And so far, have you informed these authorized persons and professional groups and registered contractors of the arrangement which will take place on the 2nd of September? Have you reminded them not to help people rush before the deadline, and that more communication should be done? Have you done that? We have been publicizing the arrangement all along, but the regulation or the amendment hasn't been passed, and we are promoting to the sector the relevant arrangements, and for targeted areas with a lot of shop signs, we will enhance publicity.
Just now we've been talking about the figure of 120,000. It used to be 190,000, and the figure sounds alarming. But then we cannot just have this presumption that we will have to work till the last one is processed, because out of the many signboards there, we adopt a risk management approach. So we will identify the most dangerous ones, and therefore in the past we would target the largest ones and also those located in the most busy districts. That's the way to make the effective use of resources. That's why it's hard to come up with a timetable, because with a timetable, it shows that it means that we will have to work till the last one is processed. But then out of the 120,000 signboards that we have identified, many of them do not require any specific action. But then with regard to the incident at Wan Chai Road, well, that took place in 2008. Unfortunately, that signboard outside the shop front of a restaurant fell down and killed a passerby, and that's why there are many works outside buildings. If they are run down, then wear and tear could make them dangerous, even though they might not have been dangerous when they were first put up. That's why we try to make the best use of resources to deal with the most dangerous works. It's not just signboards. Well, even for the other items, in the past 10 years or so, we have dealt with many overhanging objects outside buildings. Well, can you tell us more about your manpower situation? Well, I asked that both this year and last year. I think many members are very concerned about the manpower situation in the BD. So can you tell us more about that? So do you have enough manpower to deal with the inspection, enforcement, and all these programs that you've mentioned? Well, can I provide you with more details after the meeting? Because in dealing with signboards, other than the fact that we had a dedicated unit on signboards within the building services unit, we also have different teams to deal with signboards. That's why during the Special FC meeting, we already gave you some particulars. Maybe I can provide you with further details later. Well, this year, fewer members have asked questions, but then last year, over 700 questions were asked on signboards. Mr. Wu Chi-wei asking in the second round. Yes, thank you, Chairman. It's a simple follow-up. In fact, to follow on what's been said is about allocation of resources. All right, when we do business, people really are very concerned about the signboard at the shop front. I think they are relatively safe when compared to other works, but then the public are most concerned about the overhanging ones. So when I asked the first question, I already asked this. That is in your validation program, do you have any information about how many overhanging signboards there are? If you have limited resources, I think the priority should be given to these overhanging signboards. And also on the streets, there are many signboards. How should I put it? It's like a package, all right? There might be 20 operators in a building, and then they would put up this joint signboard. So under the system, how would those be dealt with? Theoretically speaking, those signboards do not belong to a single owner. There might be 20, 30 companies that have their names on the signboards, who would be responsible for filing the application, who would be putting up the signboards and so on. Well, I think this piece of legislation might not be able to deal with those signboards. Well, later on, we would also have to consider that very carefully, because whoever puts up the signboard might also be receiving money, because after all, they are advertisements. So what if there are 20 names on the signboard? So how would that be dealt with? Certainly, on management of super large signboards, you said that there would be specifications. For example, for the smaller ones, they would be subject to the MWCS, and so long as they are within 10 square meters, they would be subject to the MWIS, and then over 10 square meters, they will have to submit building plans, they will have to have an AP, and it's not the minor works registered contractor, so there will be different requirements. So can you give us a paper setting out all these details? Because here you only mention it very briefly, that 123N Am I correct? That is under Cap 123N with regard to building minor works regulations. It will be responsible for managing this. But then that has not addressed the concern raised by Ms. Sito, and therefore under this subsidiary legislation you will have to include that element. That is for super large signboards. If they are not regulated under Cap 123N, then you'll be introducing a set of stringent requirements regulating those, or else if you do not I think that will have to be dealt with properly. And also you've been saying that we do have a sufficiently large pool of professionals and APs doing the job, but then during the past 10 plus years we have already introduced different pieces of legislation, giving them a lot of business. So comparatively speaking, the workload has increased very substantially, and for those in the sector, they will know better. So can DBD tell us, has there been a corresponding increase in the number of APs or registered personnel doing the job? For example, 10 years ago we used to have 7,000, and if we still have 7,000, then is that enough? Because we have the mandatory building and window inspection scheme, and now we have the MWCS and also the SBCS. And if there is still a shortage of manpower within the profession, then it will become even more important for the priority to be set, or else you'll be stretching the manpower really thin and you might not be able to take care of everything. And that would also affect the implementation of the scheme. Even worse, well, borrowing the example of the MWIS, you might be providing an incentive for the transfer of benefits under the scheme if you do not have sufficient manpower to take care of the scheme. So I'd like to know more about the manpower situation of the profession. Yes, I'll first answer the third question first. Is about the implementation of Cap 123N, building minor works regulations. Have I understood it correctly? Well, under 123N, for the signboards, if they are not regulated under that, then actually it means that they are already in excess of the specifications, and under the principal legislation they will have to submit building plans. They cannot just do it themselves. That's why the management or the regulation is such that if they do not fall under Cap 123N, they will have to go through the normal procedures of submitting plans and so on. Is there anything specific to super large signboards? No. If they exceed the specifications under 123N, then they will not be subject to the validation scheme, and if they are unauthorized, then enforcement action will be taken against them. Because here we are only referring to signboards that fall under Cap 123N, minor works program. So if they run in excess of that, then they'll be subject to the normal approval procedure. So how large is that? 400 square meters? No, 40. So you will have to spell that out more clearly. Only a very small number of those. But Assistant Director, in fact, under the regulation, we will have a schedule, and that will set out signboards that can join the scheme and the specifications. So that would also be aligned with the minor works control system, and there are 11 categories of signboards. As we are not dealing with the MWCS per se here, that's why we haven't really moved on to the details. But then for the 11 items, well, many years ago in this council, we have had very detailed discussion, including the dimension and also the location. Some are on rooftops, some are on the ground floor, independent or standalone, others are protruding, and so on. So there are detailed requirements on the dimensions. So next time we'll give you more details. In fact, we've actually got some booklets setting out the specifications for signboards under the MWCS for the 11 categories of signboards. With the validation scheme, they can apply for validation. In other words, in the past, they were not put up under the MWCS. They are unauthorized. But then if they want to join the new scheme, they can. As regards manpower, well, concerning the construction sector, the manpower situation might fluctuate with the demand. But then for signboards, with or without the SBCS, there is still a need for the erection of signboards. There are businesses opening and closing, and therefore there is a need for signboards to be put up and torn down. And that's why we are not foreseeing a particular tight supply for professionals with the introduction of this control system. When compared to other job types, I think we do have a sizable pool of talents, some 7,400. Well, there is a question on the overhanging signboards. So do you have a figure? Do you have the figure for overhanging signboards? That was a question asked by Mr. Wu. The protruding ones. Well, for the 120,000, we're trying to collate the data. Just now, a question was also asked about the smaller signboards within a larger signboard, so you might not be able to tell who's the owner. Well, with those signboards, it shows that the major landlord or the management company might have erected those signboards, and the experience in the past is that many of them have actually applied to the administration for approval, and some would actually apply for approval before the occupation intake of the building, and then they would allow the small tenants to use that, and comparatively speaking, the management of those signboards would be better. But my question is, of course, if they are under good management, it's okay. But then we must not avoid this issue. That is, in reality, there are many signboards that have been put up, and I can't tell who is managing them or who have put up those signboards. Even if they have submitted plans for approval in the past, there should be a mechanism to ensure that the owner, after using it for a while, would review it and validate it, or at least there is a mechanism to let you know what's the state of affairs concerning these signboards. You're telling us that the BD has already conducted inspection of them. With the management or control system in place for these signboards, at least they should have reported to you that after 5 years they have done a second check and it's okay. So they should have informed you. But then apparently under the new scheme, there is no way that these signboards can be dealt with. Well, the number might not be large, but then if you've been to Mongkok, you'll see that the number would definitely not be very small. Well, if the signboards themselves have been erected properly with approval, or if they are put up under the MWCS, then in future, the inspection personnel will have to include that in their work. They have the responsibility to do it. And if there is no record about this signboard, if it's an unauthorized signboard, then under this validation scheme, they can apply for registration. But then, as we said, this is a voluntary scheme, and therefore, the only thing that we can say is that in conjunction with this, we will step up inspection and enforcement in order to make sure that there will be sufficient incentives for those who would like to go for validation will join.
So no more? Oh, Mr. Chair. Just a short technical question. This validation scheme is new, but I'd like to know for the existing unwanted signboards, the administration is still working on it, right? The other point is about the horizontal distance between signboards, 2.4 meters, right? So which ones could stay? That's a simple question. Yes. Yes. Thank you. 2 questions from Mr. Chair. I will take one and I'll defer to my colleague to take the other. Yes, abandoned signboards. Of course, the Buildings Department is continuing with its work. Last year, we handled the Buildings Department altogether demolished around 1,309 unwanted and dangerous signboards. So the Buildings Department's work continues, and I emphasize that these approaches complement each other. I'll defer to my BD colleagues to take the other question. Mr. Chow. As I said just now, the projecting signboards should have a distance of 2.4 meters with each other. I think most of them can comply because they're projecting from the shops, and the shops would span at least 4 meters. But if the distance is fewer, is less than that required, we will validate the first one that applies. Oh, we need to make things clear because we have received letters from members of the public, and I don't know whether this has been explained to them. It's on a first-come, first-served basis. Only the first one will be validated and the latter ones will be demolished. So you really need to encourage them to take part in the validation scheme to avoid disputes. Well, will it be considered on the basis of the date where the application for validation is received? I don't think we will encounter many cases in this regard. I think that's more or less the questions for today. We are going to move on to consider whether a public hearing is required. I think this issue may be of concern of various stakeholders like owners and contractors. So Ms. Clark has checked. We can have a slot on Saturday, the 15th of June, from 9 to 12, 3 hours. 15th of June, Saturday morning. So we have 3 members here, Ms. Ho and Mr. Chair, no problem. Chairman, I suggest that if possible, we should ask other members. But for members present here, you are free that day, right? Because the rooms are almost fully booked. Well, I am afraid that, Chairman, you will be the only member here, and I wonder if you need to count the quorum. Okay, so I will circulate this and ask members. Well, if possible, find some other available time slots because Saturday recently I'm quite busy. But there is a degree of urgency here because after hearing deputation's views, we need to continue the discussion with the administration. Well, talking about the urgency, then the resumption of second reading will take place on the 18th of July for the commencement date to be on the 2nd of September. So can you tell us something about your calendar? All right, one other matter. whether the scrutiny period should be extended. I think that it's necessary. The original deadline is the 26th of June. If extended, it will become 19th of June, and the deadline for giving notice of amendment is the 10th of July. If we extend it, Chairman, I suggest that it be extended. All right, it will be extended. So, date of next meeting, it's the 15th of June for a public hearing, tentatively. And we'll set the date of the next meeting at the next meeting then. Ms. Ho and I suggested more time slots or available time slots be given for us to choose. Let's see how many deputations we will be receiving. I think shop owners and professional bodies might have a greater concern on this issue. All right, if there's nothing under any other business, then meeting's adjourned. Slightly earlier than we expected. Thank you.